Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I am Vasilis, and today I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Grunde Jomaas. We're going to have an SFPE evening talk, and before we proceed with that, I would like very much to thank the Edinburgh University Fire Group for supporting this event, the SFPE International, the SFPE UK chapter, and the Institution of Civil Engineers that contributed and kindly supported our catering today. Also, I would very much like to thank the previous SFPE committee. We had elections a month ago, and I'd like to thank our previous president, Martina Manes, for all her work she did, also Christopher Bateman and Felix Wisner, who were the past members. And I would like to introduce to you the new committee, which is comprised of Yorgos Kanellopoulos, Timothy Aspinall, Zach Campbell-Lockery, and Sam Stevens. And we have some plans for the upcoming year. We would like to see some increased participation, and we thank you very much for being here. We appreciate this, supporting such kind of events. Tonight, we will have a very interesting talk on how to read and why, and where shall wisdom be found, about fire safety engineering and performance-based design and competence. I won't delay you much longer. I give the floor to Professor Jomaas.
Thank you, Vasilis. I'm just checking that I'm good sound-wise. Yeah. And yeah, we have a few people just coming in. So anyway, I'll just go ahead and thank you all for coming. The title is, I guess, ambitious. Whether I'm going to keep the promises for the abstract, we will see. But the idea for this, well, it comes as a series of two previous talks, one given by Luke, and I'm glad Luke's here today. So one of the things he said in his talk, was that his goal had generally been to be interesting and good, and to surround himself by exceptional people. So these kind of talks are also tried to be, and then Jose Torrero gave a talk about how they're guided by the light of knowledge continuity, and gave a long and good overview of the background of higher science. So I want to try to follow these two intellectuals in giving something to food for thought. The starting working title that I had was Judging Books and Engineering Solutions by the Cover, which was coming from a book by Richard Feynman, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. And in his book, Surely You're Joking, Feynman, he has a very curious and fun mind. He talks about how he was on the committee, he was a professor at Caltech, and he was asked by the California Book or Educational Committee if he could review books for math for like first to third grade. And he said, well, it's not really what I do, but I contribute to the state. And little did he know that he got something like 175 books sent to him to review, which he read all of them. And when he met for the committee, one of the ones that was ranked the highest by many was a book that was a misprint, that only had the cover and the first 2 or 3 pages. So people had just liked the colors and the front page of it, not really anything in the book. And I think this then guided me, this story led me to think of a new title about how it's important to really read things properly and do things properly, which is relevant for fire safety engineering, and maybe particularly recently where people have doing very quick solutions and not done the fundamentals properly. So the new title was then inspired by a book that I read when I was an undergrad at the University of Maryland, and that was How to Read and Why by a Harvard professor, Harold Bloom. And in that it says, read deeply, not to believe, not to accept, not to contradict, but to learn and share one nature that writes and reads. And he also goes in and says why to read, and I'm not going to read it out loud, but he talks about the importance of reading and reading the right things and to read a lot. He's been praised by many. He's been criticized by many. One of the things that he's criticized for is that he's very much dead old men, or dead old white men that are the only ones that should be read, and in the modern society maybe we should read more widely. But so I'm going to talk about how to read and why, and how we can maybe try to educate ourselves in fire science and not in literature. So starting with one of the fathers of fire science, Howard Emmons, he said that the quest for fire science, he said, just what is fire science? It's certainly not basic science like physics or chemistry. On the other hand, it's not accumulated know-how required to run an effective fire department. And I think this is capturing quite well some of the competency problem that we have right now, that people think that very basic things is enough. I overheard when I was in Denmark, somebody in an engineering situation, well, all I need to know is basically the fire triangle, and what more should I need in order to do fire safety engineering? Well, for example, I could say that you should know that there's something like a fire tetrahedron, that you should know that there's more than just oxygen, heat, and fuel. There's also chain reactions. And if you want to go into the depth of that, you can know, about collisional theory, that not all molecules that are in this room, when they collide, create any reaction. Actually, at this temperature, none of them really collide and change form or any reaction. Also, they would need to, even in a hot room or in a fire, not all of them that collide, if they're not at the right angle, nothing will happen. It's very, very detailed and complicated things that are going on. And you don't need to know this always, but if you know it, you're better vested and better suited to understand some of the complications that are going on. For example, it's also probably good to know that the speed at which the molecules in the room, on average, this is kinetic theory of gases, move at 25 degrees. They're just moving around in here now. Let's say it's 25. The most likely speed they have, or you can see is that they have about 400 meters per second. And they're hitting us, and this is creating the pressure that is on our body. If you then go to 1,000 degrees, they move faster, and hence they're more likely to collide and break up and create reactions. For something like ignition, you can think that you know the basics, but then I just took a figure from one of Jose Torrero's chapter in the SFPE Handbook, and just looking at that figure with all the symbols and all of these things going on, in that heat transfer, surface reaction, surface temperature, re-radiation, so on, we can understand that it's a very complicated problem. So knowing just the fire triangle will not really take you all the way. So the first sort of message is to read the fundamentals. You need to go in and read the fluid mechanics, the gas dynamics, the thermodynamics, and the fire dynamics. And some people say, oh, but this is old stuff. Why are you looking at this? Some of these things don't change at all. I got with one student, he's here, Ulysses, we got a review back, and they said, oh, you're citing books and old papers. Was one reviewer said, well, that's where we found that's where it was origin of the knowledge. We went back all the way. A lot of people tend to just go and where they found it and give credit to things that are 100-year-old to somebody that did it 2 years ago. So go back to the fundamentals. And also, when you look at how education is done, now in thermodynamics, it's mostly maybe steam tables and some basic stuff that may be good for applied going out in the work world, but maybe you don't have the fundamental understanding that is needed. It used to be that people in, say, fire safety engineering or that type of degree would have 4 classes in thermodynamics. And they wouldn't know what a steam table was, but they could understand what a steam table was if they got it presented to them. So what are the fundamentals? It could be, for example, the molecular theory of gases and liquids by Hirschfelder and Curtis, monumental book from the 50s from the University of Wisconsin. It could be heat and mass transfer by Incropera. You could go for fluid mechanics to go to Landau Lifshitz, or if you go really far back, you could go visit Bachelor. It's very tough book to read, both of them, but it's all there. Anyway, so that's the fundamentals. And now I'm going to change a bit into more, fire safety engineering and how reading has influenced, say, my, career, if I have any. And it started with reading to enjoy. It's not me, but it could have been me. I was reading Donald Duck and magazines in the bed. I could read probably for 10 hours straight, just go out and grab a bun or something in the kitchen and go back in bed and read and read and read, to the point where when at some point I asked for books for a Christmas gift, my sister said, "I didn't know you read books. I thought you only read Donald Duck." But I was also reading a lot of other things. My parents had subscribed us to some book club, so we read more or less all the classics in terms of Robinson Crusoe, Gulliver's Travel, all of these books that were just sort of coming in on a monthly basis, and whatever is put in front of you. And it's important to note that, if you're going to read, if you're not sure what to read, ask somebody with knowledge to guide you what to read. And this was, again, what Harold Bloom was saying. Like, I'm trying to tell people that these are in a limited, in a time-constrained environment. Read the best books. Don't just read anything, because you only have so much time available. So read the best books. Read the classics. So then I traveled and got an education. I started in Norway. I went to the US to get a bachelor's degree, and I was armed pretty well, I thought, to do some engineering work. And I went to work for a company in Columbia, Maryland, and I was at my first fire scene, fire investigation in Florida. It was a fire, a $3 million home was wrecked by a fire. Was talk about arson. The owner had received allegedly a fish wrapped in newspaper with bullets in it a few weeks before. So he was threatened, and we go in, and it was nice place. It was actually the small place in a house in the neighborhood. The neighboring house had just been sold for $30 million. It looked like a small bed and breakfast, or medium-sized bed and breakfast, I guess. And the fire was actually called in by the butler. The neighbor's butler had called in the fire. But I went in there, and there were some local firefighters. And I was about 20 years younger than today, and very fresh out of college, and I knew things. And this local fire investigator, who was a self-proclaimed fire investigator, he probably an old firefighter, didn't have any educational degree, and we were in the kitchen. And I noticed, it was a shelf all the way down at the floor, and that lower shelf in the kitchen, a wooden shelf, had a lot of burn under it and charring. And I said, well, I think it must have been something on the floor here to create all of this burn here. The roof had collapsed, so it wasn't so easy to see. And he said, because I have my basic knowledge that fire burns upwards, and it takes a long time to char wood. So it must have been burning down here for quite some time. And my line manager that I traveled with took me aside. Grunde, don't insult him, Don't be too brushy, even if he doesn't know. But anyway, so I thought, I had some fundamental knowledge, and it turned out when we dug down, we found gasoline on the floor right in that pantry. So that's exactly where the fire had started. So it was some fundamental knowledge that by the other fire investigator, it was like said as, oh, well, what do you know, you young little brash? But I was like, well, I know the fundamentals. I know how fire works. Anyway, so I tried to look up this house now. It was rebuilt, and now it's an even bigger and nicer house there, so there's renewing there. One of the second things that I got into when I was working for 1 year after my bachelor's degree was a lot of work, by some chance, a lot of work on self-heating. And one of the first problems I worked on was the combusting deer ass. So they have these bow and arrow targets that a company was producing. And one of their customers, also known as Walmart, had a fire in one of the boxes in their warehouses. And they say, and if you don't solve this problem, we won't be a customer of you anymore, which meant they were buying 5,000 of the 10,000 samples that this company had. So we were set out to try to solve this problem. So we read the theory and took out, did some tests, and I'll show a little bit more on the test. And we could figure out that if they just made the behind of the deer a little bit smaller, because it was not the middle, it was not the front, it was always the deer ass that caught fire. So we were sent, boxes of these deer asses to the company, and their Christmas parties were never the same after. But anyway, so and we figured out, and they could have just downsize the dimension of the butt, or they can make it in 2 halves instead of 1 mold, and they solved the problem based on some theory. Another problem that was related to this was paint-loaded filters. Iowa Waste Company had a lot of fires in their containers. And the company that I worked for was set out to figure this out, and they actually fired their first employee before, because this employee had not been able to solve the problem. There's some other things related to that too, but anyway. And I was, as a new engineer, set to try to tackle this. And for the company, being a small company, being just in a recession after World Trade Center, they had something like $50,000 as a closure for the project that they would not get if they didn't provide a final report. So I was set out to continue the testing and look at the data they had. And I read. What did I do? Well, I did what I did best. And they happened to have the best book for this topic by P.C. Bowes, Self-Heating Evaluation and Controlling the Hazard. It's a book that, if you try to get it now, it's very difficult to get, but you can find most papers in archives. But anyways, I read and I read. I revisited the theory and looked at how to plot it, and looked at the data, and redid some experiments. And then what we found was that the packing density was the key. So we found that if you had 2 sheets per inch or 3 sheets per inch, or how tightly do you pack these? It was because we had looked so much. It was the volatility component on how much paint we had and all of this. But in the end, it was the pure heat transfer. How much heat, how tightly packed these were. So we could see that at ambient temperatures, if you 2 and 3 and 4, if you packed it, you needed a lot less space or a lot lower critical temperature. To the point that these, as it turned out, could ignite in a container at 30 degrees or 40 degrees Celsius. And the solution was very simple, because they could now just, instead of having once a week, they could just have twice a week to send the containers away, and the problem was solved. But we read the book, went into the theory, and applied it. So what are these? This was one particular specific and very specific book. But what are the other books that should be read, and who are the authors? You know, if we're going to think of like Harold Bloom, what's the canon, the fire science canon? He talks about the canon for literature. So I would say that you should read and reread the classics, and one of the reasons you should reread is that sometimes if you read it in your first year of your studies and you read it again now, maybe you're in a PhD, you'll realize that like there's things you didn't understand the first time because you weren't prepared, because it's a sender and receiver. It happened to me many times that I read a paper and say, how did I not see that the first time? Well, you weren't ready to understand it at the first time. So there's the Howard Emmons, you know, The Growth of Fire Science. It's a classic paper that I suggest that you can try to read. There's also other papers by Howard Emmons, of course, but he's a main person to read. And one of the other things that is important with these older papers is that you'll probably experience that the way they reason is slightly different than we do now. We're very quick to it now, and we have computers and we've done a lot of diagnostics and measurements and so on. But back when, they had to really think about it and, you know, use the logic and have deduce, you know, the logic and figure out what was really going on. So there may be less equations sometimes and more just thinking and explaining it in a very eloquent way. And to avoid it being just dead old men, and not just because that, there's people that have a natural position in this, is for example, Margaret Lowe. And you can download her selected papers provided by Arab. And you can't see it here, but if you look at the index, and I can see it, but fire safety system in tall buildings, and heat radiation from fires and building separation. They're very practical things that has been looked at 40, 50 years ago, and we say, oh, well, and sometimes people just try to reinvent the thinking about it. There's Kawagoe. Here's just actually SFPE Classic Paper Review, Fire Behavior in Rooms by, so it's a review, and it's by Philip Thomas, so you can read both Philip Thomas and Kawagoe. For that. I think also it's worthwhile not to just look at the fire science, maybe go in and read some of the combustion theory and understand the things. Foreman Williams, of course, has a central role in fire safety engineering because that's where he ended up working, and he has written a lot of papers. The first edition of this book, Foreman Williams potentially is the intellectual in the society, in the fire safety engineering community. Well, first of all, he's the supervisor of, say, my supervisor, C.K. Law, but also of Carlos Fernandez Peyo. And Carlos has produced Jose Torrero and many other, and there's a lot of academics that's coming out of the thought and the school provided by Foreman Williams. He's still active today in his 80s. It's crazy to think that Jose's academic grandfather is still, not only that Carlos Fernandez Peyo is still active, but also Carlos' supervisor is still active. But people go on strong for a long time. To bound it, and we're lucky to have him because apparently from when Foreman Williams did his PhD at Caltech, one of the people on the committee asked his friend Feynman that I mentioned before from physics department and say, hi, my student Foreman Williams, he's really strong. You should you come and listen to him when he has his general exam, when you defend your knowledge in basic science and so on in the American educational PhD system. And apparently after the exam, Richard Feynman had said, your student should be in theoretical physics. But I think we're fortunate that he stayed in fire science and has contributed. He wrote the first edition of his book at age 27. It wasn't as thick as it is now, but a clear person to read. A person that many of you, how many of you know this person? Nobody. You should know this person. Lin Yan. he wrote a paper that is potentially the key paper in the asymptotic structure or counterflow diffusion flames for large activation energies. It is, and he divided in the diffusion flames into 4 regimes, and it's a full understanding of how diffusion flames can actually work and how they cannot work. And dome color theory is very relevant in there. I think Jose told me once that as a postdoc, he had spent 3 months reading this paper. So that's also something to think about, that we should try to take time to read some of the key and hard papers and not give up and try to understand them instead of just reading a new one, a new one, a new one, and adding volume, and rather just face it that it may take a long time to understand one paper, but if that's the key paper, not give up, stay with it. Other people, in terms of books, Dougal Drysdale, local here, has also, the 1985 is the first edition of his Introduction to Fire Dynamics. Also just want to do a shout out to my colleagues who arranged what I understood was a wonderful 80th birthday for Dougal, and just a couple of weeks ago. James Quinteri has also contributed. I'd selected to take a funny picture of James Quinteri just because I found it on web, but it also has the history because he's one of my teachers when I was at the University of Maryland. And we had a discussion at I think it was may have been a SFPE event or like a Salamander, which was their student society at the University of Maryland. And we had this long discussion about cow tipping. So I thought this was a fitting, for a long time I just called him Cow Tipper Jim, and he thought it was funny that I called him Cow Tipper Jim. But anyway, he's written books that are important to read, I think, Principles of Fire Behavior, Fundamentals of Fire Phenomena, and Enclosure Fire Dynamics. So these are the key things, and of course, this is an SFPE event, so we end up with what started, and this I quoted in the abstract, that the community started with the SFPE Handbook, and this led to people believing that they could do performance-based fire safety engineering. And it was a massive effort, and I think you should visit the first edition. It's very different, or quite different at least, from the current edition. The current edition, 5th edition, has 1.4 million downloads. You should all download it. And that's based on about 16K per chapter. But the newest book, I guess I'm recording, but it's been possibly a bit diluted. It's now too big, it's 2 volumes. It's difficult to get an overview of everything that's in there. It's difficult to select what to read. You might have to read chapters by me, which is a pretty bad chapter, and not necessarily necessary in that context. But there are, so already there in, say, the most central book in our field, it's too big that I think people need, at this point, guidance on what to read and not to read all of it. But I think, for me, now it's easy for you to download it. I invested it, and when I started studying in Norway for fire safety engineering, I bought it for whatever, £300 it cost, and that was a lot for a student at that time, but I bought it, I still have it, and I was sitting reading it, and it's worth, I think sometimes also to read a book like that, physical copy instead of just reading online gives you a little bit of a different feeling and respect for all the stuff that's in there. You should also take advantage of the modernization, also some of the things that have been done here at the University of Edinburgh with digital archives. You can find all the fire research notes from the fire research station, have the IFSS and so on, symposium, Asia Oceania Symposium, a lot of these things that are available, and there are a lot of papers that have the answer for what you're looking for, but it's not necessarily coming up on Google Scholar at the first search. So, why should you read? And how, I think you should read to become an expert. Try to, read in depth, and many of you here in the audience are, master students, PhD students, so on, so you're really trying to become an expert, but continue to read and be good at something in particular so that you can be confident, maybe like Feynman in this coming video.
The stuff that I got out of your serum, and I put it in ice water. And I discovered that when you put some pressure on it for a while and then undo it, it doesn't stretch back, it stays the same dimension. In other words, for a few seconds at least, and more seconds than that, there's no resilience in this particular material when it's at a temperature of 32 degrees. I believe that has some significance for our problem.
And this was him when he was called again. He was had been on the book committee for things, but he was also called in by NASA, by the U.S. government after the Challenger disaster in the 80s to be. He was a theoretical physicist, but they had a very practical problem. But in the end, and also online, like the cuttings where somebody has done, but that was basically what he did on stage. I had gone out in an ice machine in the place they had, and he took this, and he's like, I think this solves the problem. So he, had deep understanding, and this was actually the case that an O-ring had malfunctioned and caused a pressure drop inside so things could flow in places that they weren't going, and so on. But so he, even he's but he's a theoretical physicist. He has deep fundamental understanding, and actually, when he passed away, or around just before he passed away, he said there was about 2 things in science that he quite didn't understand at that point. But so he had read, and he was confident that he knew more or less all the important physics and chemistry and so on. He actually took summer breaks from when he was at Caltech. He would do summer break and work in a biology lab. He'd go and work with psychologists. He would go and work with people in other fields to see how they did things and understand, and then bring that back to his field. So in terms of me, what did I do to become an expert? Well, I did like many of you. I studied. I went to Princeton. I spent 6 years in a lab exploding things in a chamber, filled gases, and I just ignited. Thousands of experiments. But I, of course, read also to understand the theory at the same time, to understand why these flames that you see going here, they're captured with the Schlieren system, which captures the density difference between the cold gas here and the hot gas here. So it covers edge. And why, when we have a hydrogen air, they're all of hydrogen air, but when we change the composition and change the pressure, why does this flame take on such different forms? Some of it had to do with hydrodynamic instability, just the density difference, and some of it had to do with diffusional thermal instability, so the mass and heat transfer disparity. And then we try to look, also people later on follow up with turbulent flames, looked at flame speeds, reactivity, combustion chemistry, and in the end, I compiled all of these things to try to understand, using the theory and mapping out. We had different patterns, different, cellular. We could have target patterns, spiral patterns. We looked at, flame thickness, activation energy, chemical kinetics, Lewis number, and acoustic instability and critical radius for ignition, and tried to put it all where it belonged so we could understand it. And, well, it required quite some patience. I think I read about 600-700 papers there. I kept a list. We all keep lists for various reasons, but also for referencing. I still have them in my office today, and I don't really use this. So I became an expert on this, but I moved to fire safety, so I don't really use this anymore, apart from reviewing some papers here and there. But I also, like I said before, I reread, but I also visited many other fields. A lot of things I found was in biology, in physics, I read papers that, following the references and papers that I had cited these papers I was reading, and tried to understand how they wrote about it, because sometimes they write about it a little bit differently that can make you understand it. Maybe I should have understood the one paper first, but sometimes you need to read it by others, described by others, to see it the way your brain works. And I discussed. So for a lot of you, we had group meetings with my supervisor in my group, and people criticize, you be open for criticism. Tolerate that people say, oh, this is bad, and sometimes people, laughed, oh, no, this can't be right, and then I was like, well, no, I think it's right. So then I had to defend my point, and I had to make arguments, maybe come back 2 weeks later and show, no, you were wrong. What you said is not true. And then you solidified it. So try to, read and understand, and I'll get to the last point for that, or another point for that later. So what does this mean for fire safety engineering? How we read and how we should read things. Well, we've had many different fires that are reached national and international media lately. This is one of the most recent ones, with significant cultural heritage loss in Japan. And for example, there's many challenges in fire safety engineering. One example challenge is that there's predicted to be 68 million urban residents in UK by 2050. And if we look at the number of completions and height of buildings, there's a gap here. So there was an accident happening here, there's a run-in point, and people stopped really, to a great extent, building high-rises. And then we just took it up, but in the meantime, there was not really any knowledge added to it. There was not really any fire safety engineering that was added, and so well, this leads to, I'm not going to talk about it because I'm not an all-in expert, but some of that is obviously related to Grenfell Tower, that we stopped building and then we restarted building, but had we learned anything? Had we read anything? Had we done anything in between? There are things, for example, I don't know whether it's not, I'm saying the system was there, but there was reading. You have paper 11 by Margaret Law, Fire Safety System in Tall Buildings. This had been discussed back, in the 80s. Had people read it? Had people done anything? Followed any of the things that were said? Probably not. More recent discussion that Jose has written, Reach for the Sky, Why Safety Must Rule as Tall Buildings Aim Higher. And if you go and look related to this cladding situation, there's a talk by Jose. It's a TED talk he gave in India. It's pretty bad quality of the recording. But there he says something about the wake and that there's a problem with cladding. And this was, I think, the talk given in 2015. Anyway. So you should read as a fire safety engineering, I think you should read to form a waterproof argument. I was involved with Jose in a case with the Sago mine. It was a mine explosion where 13 people died, and we had a consultancy job. And I spent about a month, because I was not really an expert. I'd done the, gas explosion and so on, but not so much on dust explosion. But I read for a month or so over a summer, and worked with Jose writing a document. I think we had about 50 or 60 references. And we thought this is going to be a lot of work, leading on, because it was such a big case. Unfortunately for our bank account, that 10-page document that we wrote apparently was found so solid that nobody wanted to follow up and dispute anything afterwards. But we had read, and reread, and visited and argued and used this information to form actually an argument that people believed. But it took a lot of time. I think you should read to stay current. These are some magazines. There's obviously the SFPE magazine. There's good things, there are bad things. But you should read, also contemporary things to know what people are thinking about right now. What are your peers doing? You cannot be ignorant on what's going on right around you. You should also read to understand the difference between an answer and a result. And this is one of my big pet points, I think, in engineering and in consultancy engineering, most of the time people just want an answer because they have a specific problem that they want solved, and that's what you as a consultancy engineer is paid to do. There's nothing wrong with that. But what is wrong with that is then when people take that answer that you did, that specific solution that you created, and they treat it as a result, something that's generally applicable to all situations. I think one case could be for the Macallan distillery, where they have this new visitor center, and they have the distillery part and the nice visitor center, and they had these massive glass windows in between because they wanted people to see actually the production. And Macallan used quite a significant amount of money, both in consultancy money, but also in running tests at BRE, I believe they were done, with these big glass and sprinklers. And they found out in their situation with the type of glass and with the type of fires they applied, that this solution they could live with. But then you see later on people just think and take this off the shelf and say, sprinklers on glass works, so we'll just do this. But they don't know if they have the type of glass, what kind of background they have for the fire scenarios. And it's very finicky. For example, one of the big problems with this, from what I understand, is if people touch it. What happens if people touch the glass? Well, if people touch the glass, they have fatty fingers, and if you put sprinkler water running down the wall, there, it will run outside of where the fat is on the glass, and you'll make a weak spot. If this is then not a very thick glass, I think in this case it's a thick glass, that might lead to a weak point that will then use the solution, make the solution useless. So don't just take things off the shelf and say, oh, they did it, so I can do that. Understand what was done and apply it correctly. And towards the very end here, like I said, I mentioned gut feelings in the abstract. So I think it's important to substitute gut feelings with knowledge. Quoting Einstein, he said, intuition does not come to an unprepared mind. And this is very common in fire safety engineering, that people have a gut feeling, that people have an opinion. We don't have the data, so I'll just use my opinion. And that's why fire safety engineering differs not only in Denmark, but within Denmark, maybe from one municipality to another municipality, from North England to south of England. There's differences. And I've been using this example too. If you think in another field like bridge engineering, if you build a bridge, it doesn't really matter if you build a bridge in Turkey or Greece or Brazil. People know what calculation and specs are going to be done because they've understood the problem to a great extent for the bridge. Whereas in fire safety engineering, we do this on an individual basis, and in that country is different. But why is it? It's the same. The fire doesn't change. The materials don't change. So that means that we haven't really understand the problem. And the reason that we haven't is because we've avoided putting in the work, the hard work that it takes to actually understand the problem and gather the data properly. So we just have gut feelings, but the problem becomes when maybe your gut feeling was just indigestion after all. When that person retires, the gut feeling, you're left with no science, you're left with no solid data, you're just left with a track history of how you did it. And then you have to fight old ghosts of people, this is how we always done it here. And then that's very difficult to argue. So, for the spirit of, say, the students, you're all talented, but that's not enough. You have to work, hard and smart. And that's why I said it's wisdom found, or is it arrived at? I think it's arrived at. I think it requires a lot of work. So continue even after you study to be interested. And you're here today, so that's a good thing. There's the 10,000-hour rule that people refer to, that in order to become good at something, you have to spend that time. So when you finish, when you go out to work, participate, to codes and contribute with data and sit on committees, show up. Be the ones that participate. Today you spend an hour or so, coming to my lectures. A lot of your friends did not. If you do this 10 times a year, 20 times a year, over 10 years, it adds up a lot, and you'll be sure to know why you're being promoted and having project leader positions or group leading positions, whereas the other ones may be puzzled why why you're so lucky to have come farther. So continue conferences, CPD events, take part, be part of associations, be part of the SFPE member, student chapter, so on. And one of the things in, develop tools, develop things, contribute, make things. For example, now we have an NFPA. I'm not saying it's the greatest tool, but if people don't dare to try to make tools, we don't have anything to criticize, we don't have anything to move us forward. So I think we're at the point where fire safety engineering, we're trying to build volume. So be tolerant instead of being completely critical about the new things people are trying to do. Companies are trying to contribute, and people will say, oh, well, that was done by that company and that was done by that company. They're just driving their interest. They're still contributing. We're in a position where we're getting data that we didn't have any data before. So we're moving forward. Be positive about that. There's databases now, like the UQ Master, a big effort, cladding materials library. People are putting things in place these days. It's in that sense, exciting time for you to have all of these things available and try to use them, but also you need to participate. And you should support education, for example, the IMFC, but we're also in this unique position where the IMFC program that's here between Edinburgh, Lund and Ghent, there's a lot of companies that are interested in supporting it. And that shows that I think, we are in a time when people are interested in building up this competence and participating both in academia, both in industry, and we should use this to our benefit instead of being mad at somebody doing it wrong. Encourage them to do more and guide people if that's possible. And that's why it's great that all of our graduates go to wide places in the work environment so that we can contribute to the ones that are maybe, say, the least educated. So I think that ends us pretty much, but so you need to have absolute competences. I think it's important for fire safety engineering. We need to get, I was in a meeting earlier today, and where in Denmark they now have, in order to do certain building class, you have to go through a pretty rigorous qualification process to be a fire safety engineer, to have the competence to do certain work. I think we're at that point where that's a need for absolute competence. We can't just have relative competence. You cannot just be the best around where you are. And I do this analogy with football because it's or it actually happened to my brother who played professional handball. And there was a guy that moved there, and he come, they had won the league the last three years, and a guy showed up to practice. And he's like, I moved here, I'd like to practice with you guys, I like to play handball. And I was like, yeah, but we're the national champions, so it's the same, you cannot just go to Barcelona and say, I moved to Barcelona, I like to play. But this seems the way we do it in engineering. It's like, I'd like to have my own company, so I like to do engineering, so I'll like to participate, and I'll just take a couple of small courses, and I'll build a building and put potentially people's life at risk. It's not enough to show up. We need absolute competencies, and we need to have a proper discussion on what these are, and I know some of these are in place. And for all of you, you're in a good spot because you have qualifications, and I think that's, in the time to come, is going to be very important for you and beneficial for you. So towards the very, very end, last slide, more or less, is that you should contribute. You're in a unique position to advance the field, and so you need to read in order to be able to write, to share. It's not enough just for you to read and savor it for yourself. You need to dare to step out, and whether it's in journals or in conferences, magazines, in books. And again, when you go to conferences, keep that in mind. For many of you, say PhD students, you have a much higher training. Other people are trying to contribute in their own way. Look at what is it that was important for them that led them to think or convince them that they should contribute. See the best of it. See what, there's always the option to laugh at people, but there's also the option to say, what is the best thing they have and what can I learn from this person? It's much easier, and we often do it, of just ridiculing people. But turn it around. We're in the same room, so yes, maybe I'm better than this person, but what has this person that I can learn? So have some ideas, write it, and then do the research and loop, instead of just idea and do the research and write. Continuous process, reading, writing, and developing things. So dare to participate and share. And with plagiarism issues at hand, I took this slide from Jose. He said, is it going to be easy for you? No. Who has to do this? That's you. Do you have a choice? No. And I added, can it be done? Yes. So thank you. So, yeah, questions are welcome.
Yes, thank you very much, Grunde. Is it working?
Sometimes, yeah.
Thank you very much, Grunde. Any questions? Yes, I'll bring this to you, Simon.
That's the main task of the president, to be allowed to run around with a microphone.
Thank you very much, Vasilis. Thanks, Grunde. That was very interesting. I was wondering if you could give your opinion on, I mean, you mentioned how important it is to read, and a couple of seminal papers that we have in the profession. But as the profession moves forward, then that becomes more difficult, no? And a lot of the papers that you mentioned actually are from the 80s or 70s. So the newer papers, the new information, it's more niche. It's more difficult to find different, or say to keep yourself aware of all the different innovations that are happening within this field.
Yeah, no,
my question is more, do you think the way forward is still through the academic journals, through the papers, through exchanging information, or do you think there's a way where we can exchange information in a more flexible manner? And do you think that will make a difference into the argument that you were making?
The physicists have tried to tackle this challenge somewhat with their archives. Where they publish eventually in journals, but for them the archives are the most important, where people have a direct discussion and criticize things on the spot right away, and they dare to have a dialogue right away, and it also groups it better. I think one of the challenges, like you said now, is that there's so many journals, there's so many things where things are put, so it's tough to even find it. So I think it will be a need for some sort of archival system where it's gone on different topics, that you can follow topic streams. Because even in the competition between journals, you'll Fire Safety Journal and Fire Materials publish papers on human behavior. There's this type of pressures and conferences that are being put. So I think it's, like I said, it's very difficult to follow where it all lands, and then different national magazines and so on. So for me, I think some sort of organizational depository where it's specified by the topic that you can lead it, because it's so difficult now to get an overview. And in terms of what you said, what is the new things to read? I didn't put it in, but because say in Howard Bloom's book, he also has the criticism, it's all dead white male. That, well, a lot of these people are not dead at this point. So, but you get the point. Is that so? Who's in that sense? Who's the Cormac McCarthy? So he goes into and says, Cormac McCarthy is the guy, and this he said in the 90s, and then since then Cormac McCarthy is more or less all of his books at least has made it to Hollywood. But all the Pretty Horses and No Country for Old Men and so on and so forth. So he predicted that, and he predicted it based on it. This is good storytelling. This is something innovative, something unique. And what the main thing that we want to try to avoid is that people are just retelling the same old story. And that's his argument for reading the classic. He's like, I can read this book and I can enjoy it, but the story and the details has nothing new compared to Shakespeare or to Ibsen or to Strindberg or whatever he's quoting. So I think we need to put in and channel it somewhere more according to topic. And who's going to do that job? I don't know.
Any other questions? I do have a question. Regarding the educational programs and the attempt and the industry wishing to have more competent individuals and professionals, what does happen in the case that we have an industry that takes these professionals, and if they don't like what they get because they give them the answers they're not wanting to hear, molds them and forms them back into their idea of what a person that gets the job done, whatever that job is. And so, for example, if the firefighter in your first investigation case was your boss, and they formed you to be of a similar approach to them, so is education enough? What else needs to be done? Because people would get the degree, move on to work, and then what guarantees do we have?
It requires patience, because I'm not, there's no point in being a rebel, and sometimes you also got to realize that, say, book knowledge and so on doesn't quite work in the street smart. You'll, may know all the theory about boxing, but you go in a street fight in Glasgow, you're pretty much better off if you had been in a few fights before. And I think a lot of what happens for in fire safety engineering, maybe more so than in other engineering fields, is that it takes, from what I hear from company, the group directors, it takes 2 to 3 years for people to become a good fire protection engineer in that company. If you, in that time, become transformed into some sort of mold of that company, hopefully not, that you can still contribute with your knowledge. But I think you need to wait and bide your time, play your role, and then eventually take, say, the fight and say, can we do something differently? Because if you do it too early, there's two things. One is that you're probably just reinventing the wheel, and they're like, we know why we're not doing this, because they're smart people too. So then you just being like causing trouble doesn't do you any good, and it might be too early, so that it might be jeopardizing your 6-month review or something if you're constantly just wanting to debate instead of wanting to do. But I think, I think there are companies out there that are willing to do quite a lot of R&D, and I'm not really worried that they're not moving forward. There are, of course, companies that are quite standstill, but I think many of the companies now are aware that, and especially in today's situation, I think if we take a company like OFR, I think one of the tremendous growth they have had is because the clients also recognize that their approach, like scientific approach and with highly competent and skilled fire safety engineers, give them more value for their money. So I think we're in, again, a good position where the high competency has a good place.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yep.
I told you not, I told my students not to ask questions.
So I'm wondering, if you graduate and you have to go do a job where they have to reschool you for 3 years before you can do the job, isn't it then a problem that we learn little of a lot, but not enough of little? Like, shouldn't we specialize more in university?
Because it's the, so of course there's a lot of things you could do. What I said, for them to be an autonomous, solid fire safety engineers can go out on their own. I'm not saying that you cannot do the calculations and contribute to projects, but it's for somebody to go out in an early stage, early stage of a brief, and take it from there and understand the complexity of all the things going on. A lot of it's also related to understanding social and work interaction with the colleagues and stakeholders from all the other engineering disciplines. So, no, don't get me wrong. You can go out and you'll be able to contribute, but for maybe to be autonomous and towards a project leader. But it's all, when we have industrial advisory boards, and I ran a lot of them when I was at DTU, the company says, you think that they may want to have somebody that's ready to go right away. So, more project management and more this and more, a plug-and-play engineer. And they say, that's the last thing we want. We'll do the project. First of all, they won't be project manager until 5 or 6 years from now. And when that time comes, we'll teach them how to do project management, how we do it anyway. The core 1 or 2 courses you took are useless at that point and maybe even outdated, So today, encourage, teach people the fundamentals. We want people to be stronger in, this is civil engineer. We want people to do more geoengineering. We want people to have more experience, just finite element modeling and deep understanding of this. All of these software classes, plug-and-play engineer classes, will take care of that when they come. So that was their choice, that was their answer. I don't know if...
Thanks.
So, but don't worry, you can still work. Yeah. I'm just...
Any other question or comments?
Oh, no. Well, I think it's for the recording.
It's recorded as well, yeah. We need to put this in the books.
It's kind of part question, part comment. So I guess leading on or following on from the other questions, you mentioned competence and you mentioned, anyone can practice as a fire engineer, set up a company, start fire engineering if you like to. And you also showed a whole bunch of books that should be considered essentially essential reading for people practicing in fire safety. And I wonder if fire safety is different from other disciplines. I graduated as a structural engineer. And, if I took a graduate from a structural engineering program and hired them into a company that was doing structural engineering, I wouldn't have to tell them that I would expect them to have read a good book on solid mechanics. And yet we're in a position where we have to tell people who are either fire engineers or who want to be fire engineers that they need to read Drysdale's Fire Dynamics. I mean, I don't really know. I don't know if there's not a question here, but I just think.
So this is I see where you're getting, and the thing is, like in a program that we run here and some other program, you may not, they know it, so it's not necessarily, maybe it's the wrong audience, but I'm saying like for the ones that need to, but it's also. I fear that people are maybe just using, the lecture notes. Like how many have actually read Drysdale from one end to another? Or how many have just, like, I managed to solve the problem, so maybe we're going into like the educational path here on how we do it. But totally. How many have actually read Drysdale from one end to another? How many have read all of these other books from one end to another, or just used the parts they needed to do well on the exam? So it's that nuance there where I'm saying, like, they know what the books are, but have they really read them and gone into the depth that they master the content of it?
I guess that's kind of the point question, really.
So I think so maybe the bulk, that points back at us how we teach and what the requirements we put forward.
I mean, I think it does. I mean, which is kind of the point I want to make, and in front of the students actually, is like, I mean, the fundamental question is, does someone who graduates from our program, whether it's the BEng or the MEng or the MSc or the IMFSc, are they competent? Or do we expect them to do 3 or 4 years beyond what we do for and with them to become competent?
I think they're competent, but the fire safety engineering field is somewhat different because there's so many aspects of it that if you're going to do a full-fledged understanding of it, I mean, you've gotten a crash course in that yourself, I think, the last couple of years.
I mean, I'm not a competent fire safety engineer, no question.
No, but you've seen it through the work you've done, how many aspects there's involved in something that you could say boils down to how a facade burns. You would think that is okay, we got that sorted, and then you've spent pretty much the last 2 years of your life reading and writing and discussing and disseminating and scrutinizing, and you're like, we still need to do a lot to understand this. So I think that's, it is a very complicated field with a lot of aspects, your material science, I said the fluid mechanics, the gas dynamics, the fire dynamics. So I think that's why it's maybe just a more demanding field to get all the way around in.
I agree, as someone who has tried, yes.
No, I think that's what I'm saying, that you can do, in terms of Arjen's question, there's a lot of things you could do, sort of plug-and-play engineer and be happy, but if you want to try to reach out and really understand and move up, I think that requires maybe more in this realm than in others. And that's why for the very long time, people decided to have prescriptive code rather than performance-based design code, because it's so difficult to do the calculations and get it right, and then what is right? What is the requirement? This is another question. Anyway.
Thank you. Any other questions? Very well. We will conclude. On a last note, on the SFPE Edinburgh University student chapter, we would like to express our thanks for taking the time and coming today. We would also like to let you know that we intend to include more students in our activities and organizational activities. So if you want to be actively participating in that, if you want to be involved, reach out to us. Being a member is free. If you want to know more, come speak to us. Our emails and doors are always open for that. And on that note, I would like to thank very much Grunde for giving the presentation today and showing us this interesting stuff. So thank you. and we will keep you posted on social media and through email on future events and activities. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.